and welcome to another SonicLAB. Today we're looking at the Cre8audio West Pest and East Beast. These are two little desktop synth voices, although you can mount them in Eurorack as well. This guy is focused more on a kind of complex oscillator, West Coast type synthesis. And this guy, the East Beast, is more of an East Coast synthesis, which is subtractive synth voice. Now, there's a little bit, I think Cre8audio are onto something here, because what they've done is they've teamed up with Richard Nicol from Pittsburgh Modular. Richard Nicol is a great synth designer. He's done some really good stuff. I love some of the modules and I use them quite often in my Friday synth jams. Now with these guys, we get the heart of some of the technology in much more expensive items, but it's in this more affordable package. Because what Cre8audio do is they know how to make stuff cheaper in China. You know, yeah, let's get that right out there. Whereas Richard Nicol, Pittsburgh, his stuff is a bit more boutique and a bit more expensive, but we have essentially some of the same technology. In fact, this guy, which is the Voltage Research Lab, which is a complex West Coast type synthesis, lovely piece, I've reviewed it elsewhere, that shares essentially the same oscillator, the same wavefolder and the same dynamics controller with the West Pest, just built more affordably. Whereas the East Beast, which is a subtractive synth voice with multimode filter and a single oscillator, that shares a lot in common with the Lifeform's SV-1, which again, I use this quite a lot in my synth jams. Now, this guy has the same oscillator, the same filter, and the same VCA. So essentially, we've got quite a lot of commonality there. So let's take a look and see what we get for your money. These retail, this is around about £210, £212, 250 bucks each, so they're pretty affordable. So before we get stuck in, I just want to say thank you very much to Cre8audio for sponsoring this video. We'll just have a short message from them and then we'll get right on with it. Cre8audio are bringing their patented next generation technology to producers, musicians and sound designers, offering ultra low latencies, continuous machine learning and vast scalability made possible by your computer's graphics card. They've just released the first part of their beta suite, a collection of free plugins which will be released in bundles. The modulation bundle is available now and features chorus, phaser and flanger, all running on the power of your GPU. They also have an SDK on the horizon, giving third-party developers the opportunity to explore and create the next generation of audio plugins and effects. Apple support is also in the works. Be the first to download the free modulation bundle by signing up at gpu.audio/Sonicstate. So let's just take a listen so we can get a rough idea of what the sonic characteristics of each one is. We'll start with the West Pest. This is has an oscillator that goes into a wavefolder and into dynamics controller. Now, the wavefolder adds all the extra harmonics. The dynamics controller is effectively a low-pass gate, which has a sort of filter slash envelope as part of the way that it creates the sound. It shares sort of commonality with the Buchla sound. So if I play a couple of notes, so I just press. So that's just a sine wave into the wavefolder. I can add resonance to that, which has resonance to the low-pass gate. Now I can change the waveform, and there are a lot of functions in here which are, you know, basically accessed via the keyboard and these various shift buttons. You can hear really interesting, I mean, quite plucky sounds. And we can modulate this. Almost sounds like a kind of notch filter, doesn't it? Then we have a combination of waveforms and then a noise. So that's essentially the sound of the West Coast type oscillator. If we jump over to this guy, which is more your East Coast, which is a classic subtractive, just listen to the sawtooth into the filter. Add some resonance. Nice. And then we go through a couple more waveforms. We've got a pulse width wave. Which is a lovely sound. Then we've got combinations of waves. Finally, a sort of, sounds like a digital noise. Nice thunderous sign. In fact, if I go to this one, I've got the oscillator output going into my scopes. You can see the fundamental is pretty large in this. Massive. And then a nice shape for the triangle. And then sawtooth. Square, I'll show you that pulse width again, just because it looks nice. Oh yeah. And then combinations of the above. So we get, you know, in fact, actually, the oscillator in the East Beast is slightly different to what it is in the SV-1, because you can't do that mixing and matching of waveforms so easily. You have to put them into a mixer. So this sort of presets those things and also adds that noise, which I think is digital. But you will notice that in both of these, they have common functions. So green shift changes the oscillator, yellow shift changes the oscillator. So there are sort of common functions between the two. So we've listened to the low-pass filter on the East Beast. Let's change the filter type, because this is something that's different over the SV-1. We've also got a bandpass, and yeah, listen to those sing-song harmonics. Let's put the reverb on. That's lovely, isn't it? Then we've also got a high-pass filter. More sing-song, and we can pluck out some of those big ones. We can also set this rather peculiar function, which is kind of interesting. We can set the filter to be random. So each note press will randomly select another filter, which may be something that's useful in your world. By the same token, we can do the same thing with the oscillator. Let's just switch that off, go into low pass, and then add that to the oscillator. Do the same with the oscillator, which is, I don't know why you would necessarily use that, but I mean, there's no reason for it not to be there, and it's kind of, you know, a cool extra function. So a question to answer. One of the questions in the preview video was, how do we stop it from being plucky, the West Pest this is? Is there a way to make the West Pest not have this plucky sound, which is very much a kind of, it's a classic Buchla type sort of bong with the low pass gate. And as it stands, patching within the unit, no, there isn't. But if you wanted to patch it via another envelope, yes, you absolutely could. So maybe the best thing to do is, what I do is I'll take the gate out of here, and I'm just going into, I've got an error bus here, so I'm going to the gate into this, and then I'll come out of the gate of there, and I'll just come into the dynamic gate of the West Pest. So effectively the gate is not coming from, it's coming via the error bus, which has got an envelope on it. So let's just, there's my sound. So what I'm going to do now is I'll adjust the envelope. So yeah, if I bring the resonance, get a bit of reverb on that. Try another cut. We can still have the release. Let's have a bit of, that's quite nice. What's that like in my little riff that I've got going here? Is I've got the Nanobox razzmatazz, just playing a riff, and then a couple of other things. Let's see what happens if I press go on that. That's quite interesting. Yeah, so yes, it is possible. That was a question from Elsie Pumpkin. Right, so I'm running these out of the CV outputs of the Keystep Pro here. So I'm coming into the East Beast, and I've got gate and CV, as you'd expect. I've got a nice pulse width modulation sound, why wouldn't I? And you can see that I can go right down low. There's an interesting thing actually, because once you have the keyboard, if you've got the keyboard enabled, there's a setting to enable and disable it. So I'm playing a C here. I can transpose it effectively by the CV that's also transmitted from the internal keyboard. So I'm actually playing a note on here. So you can actually transpose it and get it really high. I think you can get 10 octaves out of here, which should you require. So full range, all nice and handy, very useful. So now if I plug in the MIDI, so I'm going to come out of the Keystep Pro, go into the MIDI input. I've got the same sound, but I'm just controlling it via MIDI. And I can transpose the incoming MIDI by octaves only. So if I press Shift, I can transpose by octaves. But you'll notice that is the lowest keyboard note I can press, and I've got -2 on here. That's the lowest I can go, and this flummoxed me for ages, because there was some toing and froing with Pittsburgh, and I was like, why isn't this going any lower? I want to play some bass lines. Apparently, and I did not know this, some MIDI keyboards, the Arturia Keystep Pro being one, have the C0 note is actually MIDI note 24. There's still a couple of octaves below, but the way that the nomenclature works with that, and this works with another couple of other keyboards as well, I don't have a full list, means that it can't go any lower. So effectively, that's the lowest I can get out of this. Now, this is kind of weird and a bit problematic, because what they did is they've calibrated the East Beast to work with the original Keystep, which I have here, which does go further down. And I'll prove that it does work. So we'll just take the MIDI out of there and we'll plug it into here, and then let's go to this. You can see that I can play the full range over this keyboard, so that's great. But it is something to watch out for, and something that really kind of puzzled me for a while. Pittsburgh, I've spoken to them, and what they're going to do is actually add some kind of tweak to the firmware, so that if your MIDI controller is one of those ones that 24 is the lowest note, there's be a combination of keys that you can press and it will sort it all out. Currently not available in this firmware, but hopefully that'll come on, and I like to think that maybe I've contributed to that and enabled that to happen, so you're welcome. So the multi-function generator, which is this output here on the patch bay, is quite an interesting idea. So basically we get to that with the multi-function. It can be MIDI modulation, it can be an LFO, it can be a random generator, it can be an envelope. So if we start with MIDI input, that's a bit fast. So now I'm basically, the mod wheel is affecting the depth of the filter because I've just punched it directly into here. Straightforward. If we want to change, there are no other parameters to change with that. So now what we'll do is we'll go to the MIDI LFO, the LFO, which is a second digital LFO, which is based on the tempo of the unit, which is tap tempo here. Now, what we need to do is, if this has got secondary function, so if I just take the pulse width down, we can divide the clock. So each of the settings in here changes the division of the clock of the master tempo. You can't change the waveform of this digital LFO, much like you can't change the waveform of this LFO either, which is a shame. It would be nice to have some other options there. Lastly, not lastly, but there's also, there's also a random generator, which again is derived from the clock of the unit. And then you can have subdivisions again to to change that. Obviously, clock can have various sources. There can be one from the input jack, there can be internal, there can be MIDI as well. And then the last one is an envelope. So now the function generator is acting as an envelope, and there are different envelope shapes. We have a very fast decay. No adjustment of the attack portion, which is a shame, because that would have been quite handy, because then we could have used that in the function generator on this guy to kind of get rid of the pluck and have a little bit of variety in terms of that. As it stands, if we want to get rid of the pluck sound of this, we need to use an external envelope. But the function generator is useful, if a little rudimentary. A couple of unique things about the West Pest. I mentioned that we only had a single LFO waveform. Actually here we can take the square output or the triangle output and go into, well, let's go fold mod, and then we can turn this is actually normal to square wave mod of that. So we do get a little more LFO functionality in the West Pest. It's worth saying if I go into FM, you can hear it's actually bipolar, so the centre frequency is somewhere in the middle, so we can't do kind of octave shifts without a bit of finagling, but it's worth mentioning. And while we're actually on the subject, we can set the LFO range on both units to be very slow to mid or up into audio rates, and if we patch that into fold mod, we get some interesting harmonics. I should also mention the multifunctions. The multi-generator is basically the same on this as it is also on the East Beast. There's another function actually which is specific to just the West Pest, and that is release mod. So if we have a sound here, classic ping-bongy sound, but release mod, what that does is modulate. It's like the VCA post envelope, so that only kicks in onto the key up or post sustain. So if we take the sustain down, let's put a bit of effects on that. Let's see what we can get with almost get some sort of wubby type sound. Take the effects off, but again, if we take the LFO range right up, some really interesting sort of AM modulation for some additional tones. Another patchy idea to think of is we don't actually have to use the wavefolder in this. We can come out of the oscillator out and go directly into the dynamics, which means we bypass the wavefolder completely, or we could perhaps use the wavefolder for something else via the patch bay. So in this patch, I've got just a sawtooth going into the dynamics control. I could change the waveform. And you can hear the resonance is quite pronounced in that. So yeah, we can go, we don't have to do that. And then we could, if we wanted, we could patch the output of the oscillator from the East Beast and go into the Wavefolder. I wonder what happens if we do that. That's interesting. Fold in, and then we could come out of the out of the fold out and bring that into the VCA in. So now I'm basically wavefolding the waveform from this into the wavefolder, which I wonder what would happen if we, what happens if we maybe, I wonder if it's possible. This would be an interesting one to do. Let's go out of the drum machine. So I'm taking a send out of here into here, and now we're listening to, let's just listen to what the drum machine's going into the wavefolder. So. Just the wavefolder. Interesting. So you're not just limited to using it in the obvious ways. We can use the wavefolder separately. We can use the dynamics, the LPG separately. So yeah, you start to kind of see some of the potential here with the patching, and that's the beauty of having this kind of semi-modular system. As I say, we can take this out, we can put it in a Eurorack, and you know, if we want to incorporate it into a wider system. But these little sort of desktop size things, I mean, for me, they certainly suit things really well, because I could just kind of put them on the shelf and bring them into play when I want to, whereas integrating them into a wider system is just a lot more cumbersome. So there are a sequencer and a MIDI functions in here as well, which we'll go into briefly. They're very much the same across both units. Okay, you get into arpeggiator or sequencer mode by pressing the shift button and then sequencer. So we've got, and then if you wanted to get into ARP mode, that'll start blinking, and then if you play an ARP, it does appear that the sequencer or the arpeggiator is a bit like a sequencer in that it will do the notes in the order in which they are entered. Right, just clear that, and we'll go back into sequencer mode. So now we're in sequencer mode. It's basically running at the tempo designated by this. So what I'm going to do is I'll just play in. You can hear basically it extends. You just keep adding notes. It's also possible to add rests. Where is it? Yes, S rest. So I could add a rest here. So now there'll be a thing at the end. I don't really like that because it sounds a bit weird. So what I'll do is I'll just go back and I'll add my notes. Okay, we'll have that. Put some effects on. Like that. So what I'm going to do is I'll add a bit of filter mod from just another patching idea. I'm going to take the oscillator out of the West Pest. I'm going to filter mod. Get it talking a bit. I want to keep the envelope out as well. So, I mean, it's an adequate sequencer. It's not the most fun to use, but, you know, it's like a sort of basic looper, and then I could always, I've got a play a drum voice on. Yeah, so, you know, it kind of works, doesn't it? Let's stop that. There's also a MIDI out on here, which means you could send the sequencer out into other kit, or you know, maybe to the West Pest if that's what you wanted. And the sequencers are both the same, and the arpeggiators are both the same on each one. So, I mean, in terms of, you know, it's not going to win any perhaps sequencer design awards, but it's nice to have, I guess. So, a couple of questions. This one came in from Mika Pollock, which was in the preview video I posted. How would you daisy chain them if possible, meaning sending MIDI to one of them and then letting that one control the second via MIDI or CV? That is indeed possible, because you can set, if I go to, you can set the MIDI out to be out or through. So you could go out of here and then into here. So you can set the MIDI through, so that would work as a daisy chain, and if you set them on the same MIDI channel, that would certainly work. You got for a bit of a two for here, because do I find that oscillator pitch higher than other synths? I know that you can pitch them down, but I have to use a blockless MIDI hub to get them low enough. Can be an issue if you want to seek them externally and try other synths, for example, for a bass line. That's a fair point, and I did cover that earlier. Certainly with the KeyStep Pro, I'm not able to get fully lower down the octave scale, but certainly with the KeyStep I was, and there are obviously plenty of other keyboards, and if you're running it from a DAW or maybe another sequencer, it'll probably work fine. And Pittsburgh did say it's a pretty trivial thing to change the firmware, so I'm guessing they're going to be doing that fairly sharpish. I guess probably the question you're all asking is, which should I get? That's a good question. I mean, I think the East Beast does sound really nice. It's a great subtractive voice. Basic, but the quality and the girth of the oscillator is definitely something that you shouldn't rule out just because it's another subtractive. And that with the filter, a really nice combination. Whereas the West Pest has sort of a more unusual, maybe a bit more accessible, more in terms of affordable than a kind of pure West Coast module, but it gets some really interesting sounds. I think to get the most out of it, you probably need some external patching. So if you wanted to change it from a bong to more of a sort of enveloped sound, you will need an external envelope. So that's something to watch out for. But I suppose you could always get them both, and then you'd have two voices, wouldn't you? And that would be $500. I don't know if there are any deals out there, but I mean, it seems quite reasonable. I think for me, it feels like some of the functions I would rather, and I don't know necessarily, I would rather that we didn't necessarily have the keyboard, although, to be honest, then we wouldn't have access to some of these additional functions, and we had maybe a little bit more going on, like either, you know, another LFO or more LFO shapes, certainly on these Beasts. But, you know, in terms of just the core sound of them, they both sound really quite good. So, you know, well worth checking out if you're after an affordable, decent sounding oscillator or sound source, or certainly West Coast. So I guess the jury's out. It really depends on which kind of sound you gravitate towards. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. That was the East Beast and the West Pest. And also I want to say thank you very much to Cre8audio for sponsoring this video. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time.